I'm Niall Paterson. Welcome to the Sky News Daily, where once again the Post Office Horizon IT scandal has reared its ugly head. Today, Keir Starmer went on the offensive at PMQs. Just have a listen to this.
So let me press on, because on Monday the Business Secretary also confirmed categorically that the Post Office was, and I'll quote this in fairness to the Prime Minister, at no point told to delay compensation payments by either an official or a minister from any government department, and at no point was it suggested that a delay would be of benefit to the Treasury. So that's Monday. A note released by the former Post Office chair this morning appears to directly contradict that. And I appreciate the business. This really matters to the people who've been at the heart. I appreciate that the Business Secretary has put the Prime Minister in a tricky position. But will he commit to investigating this matter properly, including whether that categorical statement was correct and why, rather than taking those accusations seriously, she accused a whistleblower of lying?
Mr. Speaker, it is worth bearing in mind that, as the Business Secretary said on Monday, she asked Henry Staunton to step down after serious concerns were raised. But this is, on a matter of substance, one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in our nation's history, because people who were working hard serving their communities had their lives and reputations destroyed, and that's why we are working hard to ensure that they get justice and compensation, and that's why we established Sir Win Williams' inquiry. It's why we've already paid out over £150 million of compensation to almost 3,000 victims, and it's why we will introduce new legislation shortly to exonerate those. We will make sure that we do what is needed, that the truth does come to light, we right the wrongs of the past, and crucially, that victims get the justice that they deserve.
So what's this all about? Well, the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, has been locked in a war of words with the former chairman of the Post Office, Henry Staunton. He said he'd been directed by the Business Department to slow down the process of compensation. She said that was a lie. Now Sky News has obtained a copy of the memo Henry Staunton wrote to himself and the CEO of the Post Office following a conversation with the Business Department's chief civil servant, Sarah Munby. In it, he records that she directed him to hobble into the election, not to rip off the Band-Aid in terms of Post Office finances, that it was not the time for dealing with long-term issues, and that politicians do not like to confront reality. The government continues to deny any suggestion that it directed Henry Staunton to go slow, instead maintaining it was the government which had actually sped up the process. So, what is the truth of it all? Well, that's exactly what the Commons Business Committee is looking at, with Mr Staunton due to appear before them next week. We'll get the analysis of our Deputy Political Editor a little later, but let's begin with Liam Byrne, of course, the Labour Chairman of the Business Committee. Look, can we just deal with this in the macro to start with? Are we now at a point where we can objectively say that the government handling of the Horizon IT scandal has been a mess, has been a disaster?
We can definitely say that, but the key thing for me, the key proof, if you like, is the numbers. If you look at the number of people who were convicted, very few of them, maybe 5%, have actually had a full and final settlement for the redress that they're owed. But equally, if you look at the group that Mr Bates was part of, it's called the 555 group, very few of those folks have had full and final redress either. And of course, what we're now learning from the leaks is that even ministers were cited on this problem years ago. But years on, we've only got 4 or 5% of people who suffered the biggest miscarriage of justice in British history with full and final redress.
Let's talk about the latest revelation, the memo, the self-penned memo by Henry Staunton, former chairman of the Post Office, following a conversation with Sarah Munby, then the top civil servant dealing with all of this. You'll have seen the memo, and it does appear to suggest that at the very highest levels of the civil service, if not necessarily the political side of government, there was an insistence that the Post Office should go slow, at least this side of an election. What do you make of it?
So I've not seen the memos, I've seen the reporting of the memos. And so what our committee is doing is we're putting Mr. Staunton on the stand next week. We will put Mr. Staunton on oath, as we often do, but we're also giving Mr. Staunton the protection of parliamentary privilege. So he is free to speak in a full, frank and candid way. But ahead of that meeting, our committee has the power to send for papers. So we're working out now what are the papers that we need to send for ahead of Mr. Staunton's evidence session so that we can publish them for everybody in Parliament and the public to see.
But it cannot be good. I'll just read you one of the quotes that we have from the Times reporting this morning. She said, referring of course to the senior civil servant, "We needed to know that in the run-up to the election, there was no appetite to, quotes, rip off the Band-Aid, quotes, now was not the time for dealing with long-term issues. We needed a plan to, quotes, hobble up to the election." Now, if that is not a direct instruction from government to drag your heels over the payments to the sub-postmasters, I don't know what is.
Agreed. I mean, this is a go slow order, without a doubt. And what that means is that we have more people dying, literally dying, before they get full and fair redress for this miscarriage of justice. Now, the Secretary of State came to the House earlier in the week to absolutely categorically deny that there was a go slow order. But now we've got evidence from Mr. Staunton that there was a go slow order. So what we've got to try and do as a committee on Tuesday is to basically flush out who is telling the truth. And the reason that this is so important is that there's a new bit of legislation that's coming to the House of Commons, which is going to overturn the convictions. And I think we might need to use that bill to actually write into the law of the land a hard timetable for getting everybody paid. And that's why this debate is not a kind of a theoretical debate about who said what to who. This is about people's lives, ultimately, and whether we can get the law right to deliver justice to those people.
I understand your desire to focus on the redress, that those who have been unfairly treated will receive compensation and timely compensation. But it is a little bit more than a he said, she said, isn't it? In the sense that...
But it is now.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, is it possible that the then permanent secretary at Business was acting in a manner that the Secretary of State at the department did not know about, was unaware about, or perhaps disapproved of?
Well, look, I've been a government minister, so, I can say that sometimes those things happen. But, our committee is determined to get to the bottom of the truth. And so if you've got a Secretary of State basically saying, in terms, to Parliament, this instruction was not delivered, but now we've got evidence that somebody did indeed issue that go slow order, then frankly, somebody's got to be held accountable. And so if necessary, if the committee agrees, the committee may well decide to put the permanent secretary and indeed the Secretary of State on the stand to get to the bottom of this. But our first step is to try and get the facts on the table. And that's why next Tuesday's evidence session is important. We'll be hearing from Mr. Bates himself. We will be hearing from Department for Business Trade Civil Servants. We'll also be hearing from Nick Reed, who's the Chief Executive of the Post Office. And many people, I'm sure, on the committee will be asking him, can he corroborate what Mr. Staunton has said? And then we'll be hearing from Mr. Staunton himself, and we'll be publishing all of the associated documents. So, I'm hoping that Tuesday's session will help us actually shine a light on the truth.
Just to be absolutely clear, as things stand, the former permanent secretary at Business, Sarah Munby, she has not been slated to appear in front of the committee, but it is an option being held in reserve.
Correct. Yeah. So the formal powers of a select committee are quite simple. We have the power to send for people and papers. That's how the standing orders are written. But those powers are pretty absolute. So if we need to summon people, frankly, then that is something that we will do, because you can't have a situation where the Secretary of State is saying one thing, but there's clear evidence that her officials were saying something else. We've got to try and understand what exactly has gone on here. But as I say, from our point of view, we know that people have got to be held to account, and that's an important job for the committee. But the reason that is important for me personally is because I want to make sure that this new piece of legislation is bang on and delivers justice at last for those who've been wronged.
So it is possible at this point, ahead of Tuesday's evidence session, that Kemi Badenoch did not know, but presumably that also means that it is also possible that Kemi Badenoch misled the House? I mean, in those circumstances, what should happen?
Well, look, I mean, the code of conduct then comes into play. So the code of conduct is that basically the rules of the game for ministers. It dictates how they should behave. The Prime Minister is the arbiter of the code of conduct for ministers. It's called the Ministerial Code. But if a Secretary of State has misled the House, and I really hope that hasn't been the case, but in those circumstances, then our Constitution still expects ministers to resign.
I have seen others who've had sight of this memo written by Henry Staunton to himself and, of course, to one other, that take a slightly different view. That when we see Sarah Munby talking about long-term thinking, operational issues, no need to rip off the Band-Aid, that rather than talking about the Horizon IT scandal, it is entirely possible that she was talking instead about the lack of profitability within the Post Office, the ongoing pay routes that exist within the Post Office. What do you make of that assessment?
Well, look, we just don't know at this stage, but if we basically need to get the individual in front of a select committee on oath under parliamentary privilege in order to cross-examine her to get to the bottom of what was meant, what was actually said, then that's exactly what the committee will want to do, because Parliament needs to know the truth, basically, and the public needs to know the truth, and you need to know the truth.
When we take a step back from this, I mean, how significant, how important is this memo when set against the fact that we already know that the Post Office was economical with the truth when it came to, for example, remote access of the Horizon IT system, that when they were dealing with individual sub-postmasters, they told them directly that you're the only one who is experiencing this. I mean, yep, it speaks to a level of perhaps paralysis or inertia in government that you see the Permanent Secretary at Business saying these things. But ultimately, isn't the greatest fault with the Post Office itself and the way in which they have handled this from day one?
Well, you're right. There is a clear pattern of the Post Office basically trying to cover its tracks. There's been fresh evidence this week that the Post Office basically cancelled investigations that were in danger of shedding light on the fact that they did indeed know about this remote access. We've also had evidence this week from Freedom of Information requests that show that ministers were cited on that quite early on. And my committee published evidence yesterday that we got back from the Post Office that showed, confirmed on the record, that the Post Office knew about remote access as early as 2004. So, we are now going back 20 years that the Post Office has known about some of these problems. So given those circumstances, if you're a minister where you've got an agency of your department, and that's what the Post Office is, remember, because the government is the only shareholder in the Post Office. If you've got a situation like that, your grip is so tight. I mean, you are completely on top of it every day because, let's remember the big picture. This is the worst miscarriage of justice in British legal history. That's what we're dealing with. And you've got an agency at the front end of this with a track record of covering it up time and time and time again. That's what we pay ministers to go to work to do, to grip these situations and sort them out. And now we're in this unfortunate position where we've got the Secretary of State saying one thing to Parliament, but that being contradicted by the evidence of Mr. Staunton. So, we have got to get to the bottom of what exactly happened. We have got to hold people to account. But crucially, we've got to change the law so that the sub-postmasters get paid.
We have covered this story an awful lot on the podcast. And I suspect occasionally you will feel the same as me, that looking at what has gone on, I sometimes feel like I've been taking crazy pills. I mean, isn't the clearest example, the clearest evidence, I should say, that the government dragged its heels on the Horizon IT scandal, not even the fact that, only 5% of sub-postmasters have actually had some form of economic redress, but the fact it took an ITV drama to get them going in the first place.
Well, and remember, we've still not seen the bill that is promised. So in the wake of the drama, the House of Commons was absolutely packed. I mean, there have been some MPs. I mean, James Badenoch was obviously famous, but, there were people like Kevin Jones, my colleague, and a number of others who have been on this for some time. And it's been a lonely fight for them often. After the drama, the House of Commons was packed to the gunnels. And it was at that moment that the government said, right, we are going to get a grip of this. We are going to sort this. We're going to present a bill that overturns the convictions and gets redress sorted. Well, we're weeks on and there's still no sign of the bill. I put down a parliamentary question last week to say, right, when is it? And the answer was, it's coming within weeks. I think yesterday somebody said it's going to be imminent. Well, where is it? Because we've got to get on with amending it, kicking it into shape so that it passes the Mr. Bates test of full and fair redress in a way that is actually fast.
We will be tuning in to watch you and your colleagues next Tuesday when Henry Staunton will be appearing. Liam Byrne, great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Stay put. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Sky's Deputy Political Editor. Back soon. Welcome back. Strong words from the chairman of the Business Select Committee. As promised, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is here. Sam, just what did you make of my chat with Liam Byrne?
Well, look, Liam Byrne he's an important figure because he's chair of the Select Committee. So, yes, he's a Labour MP, but he's more than that. And so his comments about what the memo released by Henry Staunton may or may not amount to are important. He suggested that does potentially conflict with statements by Kemi Badenoch, the Business Secretary, earlier in the week. But really what you got from the chat that you were having with Liam Byrne was this sense of the sort of net tightening. What's going on with the Post Office story? And I totally appreciate that you on the Sky News Daily have followed it very closely, but for those that haven't, it sort of had lots of different phases. Now we're in that kind of phase of one of these sagas where there are lots of building blocks that could cause quite a lot of trouble for Kemi Badenoch. Inescapably, next week there's going to be a hearing with Henry Staunton himself, who will be speaking under oath and with the protection of parliamentary privilege. And at that point, he will be grilled what his memo, basically his notes of a conversation about interactions with senior civil servants in the business department, what it actually means. And if that then transpires to factually directly contradict the business secretary, then, she's potentially in quite a lot of trouble. And the committee can exacerbate that trouble by calling her before then. So we now have a series of kind of news moments of kind of hearings and infrastructure, from which Kemi Badenoch is going to have to sort of account for herself. Now, Kemi Badenoch, up to this point, has acted decisively and firmly, but not without quite a lot of anger and aggression, and has appeared in the House and taken questions, but hasn't submitted herself to the kind of detailed cross-examination that you get in a select committee. But that could come after next week's hearing. So the question is, in the cold light of day, was she wise to say some of the things that she said on Monday?
Wasn't that, in essence, what Keir Starmer was trying to do today at PMQs? He was trying the barristerial, lawyerly approach of setting out the differences between the position of the Business Secretary and of the former chairman of the Post Office, because the two accounts are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, look, what Keir Starmer was doing was challenging Rishi Sunak to repeat the words of Kemi Badenoch. And notably, he didn't. He just didn't. He refused to say that there was no go slow when it comes to the compensation payments. And that felt quite significant. He sort of defended Kemi Badenoch on the grounds that he was, as it were, making out that Henry Staunton is a bad faith witness because, she sacked him. And therefore, to a certain degree, you can't trust what he said. Well, that may or may not be true. We just can't know at time of speaking, but there's a reasonable chance that we do end up knowing in time once this select committee has done its job, because in the end it's quite a binary issue, Neil. This is why I think it's so problematic. Either senior civil servant indicated or said to the head of the Post Office that effectively slow down compensation payments, or they didn't. And Kemi Badenoch saying the interview was full of lies and all the rest. In the end, at the moment, we can't quite reconcile those two accounts, but it will be possible to do it. And at that point, one of them presumably wasn't quite telling the full truth.
But stepping away from Westminster just for a second, what, if anything, does the Staunton memo actually change? If you are a sub-postmaster, presumably you already believe I would argue they would say that they know that the government has dragged its heels on this particular issue.
Yes, I'm less surprised than some by the central assertion made by Henry Staunton that there was a sort of go slow on the compensation payments, only because this is quite routine government policy. I mean, there are other areas like contaminated blood where there's a go slow on compensation payments. They wouldn't put it like that in public. But I think there is a nervousness in the Treasury about what year billions and billions of pounds of compensation payments fall to be released, because it has an impact on the deficit and how much money you can bluntly spend on tax cuts. So what we're talking about here in Whitehall terms is not unprecedented or unusual. But in the context of the biggest scandal that there's ever been, the biggest legal scandal and miscarriage of justice that there's ever been, of course, it's extraordinary.
That was going to be my point. I can see from a corporate standpoint why big companies might drag their heels, refuse to pay compensation until the very last minute. They're beholden to their shareholders. But as you've just alluded to, we are talking about the government, not private enterprise, working with the Post Office on a story which, frankly, has been in the public domain for the best part of 2 decades.
Well, exactly. And, you essentially have, one bit of government whose, priority, for want of a better phrase, is to, look after the public finances and not shell out money today that they could maybe delay until tomorrow. And this is the story on this, just as it is on thousands of other line items of potential government spending. But that kind of crashes into the reality that here we have sub-postmasters dying without ever having been compensated, because quite rightly they will see the government having dragged its feet, which they did. And, you've got those two impulses, those two different kind of attitudes colliding, and they're fundamentally incompatible. Look, it's the job of politicians to pick a side in this kind of stuff. And a sensible politician that wants kind of to be seen to do the right thing, you can make up your own mind what they would have done, what they should have done. There's a system that tries to stop unnecessary public spending. That was in operation. And there was a system trying to work through a compensation scheme, and that wasn't going very fast. And, in the same way that setting up a lot of things doesn't go very quickly in government. It's just, it requires good politicians to take the right decisions. And now at the centre of this drama, we've got Kemi Badenoch and the question of, whether or not she told the truth.
Thank you, Sam. It would be remiss of anyone to see the Staunton memo as a bit of Westminster bubble tittle-tattle, just another example of he said, she said pantomime politics, for it is simply impossible not to get the memo, so to speak. There, in black and white, is Kemi Badenoch's permanent secretary saying this was not the time for dealing with long-term issues, that the chairman of the Post Office should instead hobble towards the election. The truth is, the row has thrown the cat amongst the pigeons and then the whole menagerie under a bus. Roll on next week's Select Committee session. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you next time.